is their color analyst. He is Kevin Collins. Kevin, thanks so much for hopping on today.
Thanks so much, Brian, for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, question one. I just need to verify this to make sure. Quentin Post is finally gone, right? Like he can't hurt us anymore. Is he finally not in Boston College?
I'd have to ask you the same thing about Joe Girard.
Yeah. Well, our fans were trying to get rid of Joe, too, so everyone was trying to get rid of Joe. I think Joe is finally out of ACC eligibility. I lost Joe. He's somewhere overseas. He's in Europe somewhere. I forget at the moment. But here we are getting ready for this game. You know, Post was so good the last couple of years. He was really the identity of that team. What would you say is the identity now? I mean, that was him the last couple of years. He dragged him to the postseason. What would you say Boston College basketball is this year in his absence?
Yeah, first of all, QP, hats off to him finally getting into a game. I think it was back on December 30th a couple weeks ago for the Golden State Warriors up at the big club level and getting in the scorebook as well against the Cavs, which was a thrill, for all of his former teammates and coaches, put a smile on everybody's face for sure. But you mentioned identity, and that's something this team is still, I think, very much looking for. We thought we might have found it down in the Cayman Islands, Boston College winning their MTE this year. Down at the Cayman Islands Classic. They beat a pretty good Boise State team in the championship game of that tournament. And I did a hit earlier with one of your colleagues in Syracuse today, and I mentioned the score of that game, 63-61. BC holding the Broncos to 61 points when they had been averaging in the upper 80s for the first, 10-plus games of the season. I think that's got to be the identity of this team. They can't play games in the, mid to upper 70s into the 80s. They just don't have the firepower and the scoring potential that they had last year. They really got rated in the transfer portal. Post, you mentioned, in the NBA, the other four starters are all playing at Power 5, Power 6 schools and starting, so they lost everybody. Really, the only player that played any sort of minutes last year, Donald Hand Jr., who only played about a dozen minutes, maybe 14 minutes a game, he's leading the team in scoring this year, but was really a bit piece on that team last year. So I think defense is going to be the identity, and trying to kind of muck it up, if you will, is going to be the way they have to play.
Was that straight NIL, why everybody bailed? What's your sense of why that turned over so much?
Yeah, I mean, Coach Grant obviously returning and his staff largely in place, and I think with the landscape of college basketball, it's how big is the purse? How big is that bag that you're going to offer some of these kids? And when you offer six figures and up, NIL deals that are significantly more perhaps than what these kids made last year, plus a couple of them, they went to brand name schools. Jaden Zachary starting down at Clemson, Devin McLaughlin, he went to Vanderbilt, and who could say no as a college kid to go to Nashville and go to school, right? So there's plenty of opportunity out there for these guys to make money. And you mentioned the postseason, right? Boston College won 20 games for the first time in a long time last year. They won a postseason game for the first time in 15 years. They were on national television a couple times, in the ACC tournament run, won a couple of games. So these guys that were in the starting lineup for Boston College last year started to get a lot more publicity in the month of March through the ACC tournament and the NIT, and I think that's when they really popped up on other teams' radars.
Yeah, if you're a coach on a staff that's out of the tournament and you're sitting around, you pop on one of those NIT games on a Tuesday night, you see a guy, and, things lead to things, and that is college basketball these days. How do you sense BC is positioned in NIL? We've talked a lot about this with Syracuse, and every school's dealing with this. Bill O'Brien's there with football now. I'm sure a lot of funds are going his way. How is the basketball program kind of positioned in the BC sporting space right now?
Yeah, Boston College and Syracuse, the old Big East rivalry, both with, storied football programs and trying to kind of find their way, I think, in this NIL space. And I think BC is right there with a lot of schools trying to navigate how to bring money in, one, and two, how it gets delegated when you've got a major program, in the football space as well. How much of it are we going to give to football? How much are we going to separate for basketball? So I think your question is totally valid, trying to figure out, what your budget's going to be for each of those programs. I think it's tough. You're in a pro sports town, and you're trying to raise money. there's a lot of other places that, companies and entities would like to spend their money when you think about Boston, with the Celtics in play, the Patriots obviously not being great the last 5 years, but they had their 20-year run, the Red Sox, the Bruins. There's a lot of different, factors at play where money can go from a corporate side. But I think what you really have to do in Syracuse is obviously great at this too, is just rely on your alumni base and try to figure out how can we get people involved, former alumni that are now, in good financial places in the world. And I think with Boston College, historically, it's not something they probably really thought about, with Father Leahy paying college athletes is just kind of not really something on their forefront. So they're very much getting their feet wet. And I think that's potentially, why you saw a bunch of kids bolt, because the budget for what, BC can offer is, I think, a little bit maybe behind some of the other ACC schools, or the SEC definitely, where Claude Harris Jr. went to Mississippi State. So I think there's some catch-up to do there, but it's tough with an ever-changing landscape, to be critical, because I think, former Mass Governor Charlie Baker, in charge of the NCAA now, he's trying to get his head around this and regulate so that there's a more level playing field, and NIL is, I'll say, a more friendly or fair space for everybody, top to bottom, in college athletics.
Yeah, I'd say good luck to anyone trying to make it more fair going forward. I don't know.
I agree with you.
Yeah, where the end of the road is on that, but it is the Wild West still for sure, and it's obviously tough for any head coach to navigate. Earl Grant, though, I mean, Kev, he's done a fantastic job here, taking a team that BC was lost in the wilderness for a decade, basically, and he's gone 13 to 16 to 20. What was he able to do to get the train back on the tracks there?
I think Coach Grant does a tremendous job, I'll say, taking pieces, and I think the portal is part of this. I think, recruiting is obviously part of it, but he's able to take pieces that other teams might not look at and say, oh, this guy is Cooper Flagg, or, a first ballot, first team all-conference player, and Coach Grant is looking to assemble a team. I think he does a great job of finding pieces that might not be at the forefront of another program, bringing them in, and making them contributing players as part of a rotation. Where we are currently at this year, I think Coach is trying to figure out what his rotation is still. I think you look back at some of the recent games, and he's playing 10 to 11 guys at times in these games. That's a lot of guys, and he's not afraid to try to give guys opportunities to prove them wrong, or if someone's not getting the job done, come sit next to me. And I think that goes a long way. But when you lose what he lost last year, I think that team, I'll say, chemistry and everybody knowing their role and when they're going to come in and what they're supposed to do or what they're going to be asked to do for the team, I think that is still largely in flux and being figured out by this year's group, because really, when you think about it, none of these guys have played any sort of meaningful minutes together prior to this year.
I still feel with Coach Grant, I mean, the energy he brings, maybe the amount of time he spends in a defensive stance during the game, it's got to be infectious, right, for the guys to play for a guy like him.
It certainly is, and I think that's his identity, right? We talked a little bit about that early in our conversation. I think the identity of this team needs to kind of be centered around him, and this team needs to take on his identity and get down, slap the floor, as we used to see in the old days. And I think this team needs to play, for the most part, in the 60s if they can, lower 70s at worst case, and just really be a defensive-minded team, control the pace, I'll say pick and choose your spots where you want to get out and transition. And I think if this team's able to do that, they can take a step forward from where they're at, sort of toward the bottom. BC and Cuse both 1 and 3 in the ACC. I know not the starts that both schools were hoping for, but I think tomorrow can go a long way to springboard these schools in one direction or the other. I think you can make an argument it really is a pivotal game, and it's really the quarter pole point for both schools. So I think tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we'll learn a little bit about where these schools are at. I know Cuse had a good win this week over a good Georgia Tech team that blew us out last weekend. So I'm really excited for this game tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, it's always something interesting, I feel, happens when Syracuse and BC get together out there. You mentioned Donald Hand. He was there last year, but his role is, expounded tenfold this year. What kind of player are Syracuse fans going to be seeing when they watch him tomorrow?
Yeah, we mentioned he was kind of a bit player on last year's team, a bench player, and now he's being asked to be the head of the snake. He's averaging, just over 14 points a game this season. He's Boston College's leading scorer. He's an athletic, I'll say larger wing player, 6'5", 6'6". He's very well put together, not slight of build. He can play a little bit bigger than he is. He's actually leading the team in rebounding, which I think is a little bit of an eye raiser to me. I think it's actually a nod to Donald because he knows without Quentin Post and without Devin McLaughlin, who's now starring down at Vanderbilt, this team really lost all of their post presence and size from last year's tournament, NIT team. So he's really taken it upon himself to not only come down and give a hand to the post when it comes to defending, but really getting his nose dirty rebounding. He's averaging over 7 rebounds a game, which is far and away leading Boston College. So he's an athletic wing. He can shoot the three. He's a 90% foul shooter, so he's a good, solid jump shooter. And he's actually, I think, some Syracuse fans, if he gets out in transition, will find it, I'll say, a little bit of a throwback. His mid-range game is actually, I think, one of his best attributes. He's foul line extended, elbow jumpers, and he can also kind of do that with his back to the basket, those turnaround or fadeaway jumpers. Those are kind of a lost art in today's game with the three ball. So I think you'll see a little bit of a throwback with Donald tomorrow if you pay attention.
Who knew that the mid-range shot was still allowed? I didn't know they still give you points for that. It's nice to see somebody actually realizing you can put the ball in the hoop from somewhere else on the court other than the three-point line and the rim. All right, Kevin, how do you think this plays out tomorrow? What are you expecting to see on the court when these two teams get together?
I think for Boston College, it's really going to be how do they defend, especially the high ball screens. That's been a problem in recent weeks. And when you get Starling, maybe Lampkin rolling, they've been switching too much, in my opinion, at times. And I know, speaking to Coach Grant, after the Georgia Tech game, he was adamant, Boston College has had a whole week off to prepare for this game. They lost down in Atlanta to Georgia Tech last Saturday. So they'll have a full 7 days. And when he visited with us post-game, that was one of the first things he talked about was trying to get better at defending ball screens and not always switching, because whether it's the guard getting caught on the big with that mismatch down low or one of our bigs being forced to play out on the perimeter against a speedier guard and the guard dribbles right by him, that's been happening, too much for Coach Grant's liking. So I think kind of shutting that down from Starling and Lampkin's perspective. I know Starling, the last 2 visits to Connie Forum, he's averaging about 18 points a game. So he likes this building. He likes to score in this building. So that's going to be a key. I think this is going to be a really, hopefully, tightly contested, old-school Big East game. I don't see a ton of points being scored. I think it could be a little bit of a war down low. I'm really looking forward to watching Lampkin bang on Chad Venning, which is a St. Bonaventure transfer that Coach Grant brought in. Both those guys, 6'10", 6'11", well over 250 pounds. You're going to have 500 pounds a guy just banging on each other, underneath the basket. So I'm really looking forward to that matchup, and I think it could be more of an old-school Big East war tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, always fun to enjoy. Turning back the clock for one of those every now and again. All right, Kev, thanks so much for hopping on for a few. Appreciate the time. Enjoy the game tomorrow.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure being with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, there he is, Kevin Collins from the Boston College